Thanks, Rachel, and thank you everyone for coming. As Rachel said, this talk is perhaps a wee bit of a nostalgia trip for me in a way, because it was the occasion of my first visit to the Turnbull nearly 30 years ago. Quite scary how short a time ago that seems. In those days, of course, we didn't have the internet, so I'd come up to look at bound copies of the Māoriland Worker, which was a wonderful discovery. And it shaped the interpretation to an extent, but many other things have as well. And what I want to do tonight really is give a sort of a broad discussion of the 1913 strike, put it in its context, not go into the sort of detail that I might have because of the, as we heard, there are other discussions on that later in the year at the Museum of Sea and Sail, which will be really interesting. And I thought it would be more useful if I put this in a broad context, because it was the culmination of several years of intense debate and sometimes confrontation in the labour movement in New Zealand political society. The strike itself, as a number of historians have suggested, was class war. It was not just a fight over wages and conditions, it was a power struggle. It was protest. This photograph has been reproduced a number of times. It's of a strikers' march in Auckland. The lines on the lead banner: "If blood be the price of your cursed wealth, good God, we have bought it fair." Lines from a parody of one of Kipling's imperialist verses, apparently, and I think it makes clear the depth of feeling and the breadth of the issues. And on the other side of the fence, Massey's Cossacks, as they came to be known, in reference, of course, to the tyrannous shock troops of Tsarist Russia. This photograph, a group of Auckland farmers in camp, at least you see the batons that they were issued with. And while this is not an anti-special constable propaganda picture, it does show the other side of the equation. Well, the strike was triggered by two separate disputes, and the first thing I'd like to do is just run through the chronology of it. The first dispute was at Huntly Coal Mining District in the Waikato. On October 6, the Taupiri Coal Company sacked 16 union activists, and a couple of days later 500 miners went out on strike demanding their comrades' reinstatement. The second trigger was a dispute here in Wellington between the shipwrights on the wharves and their employers. Now, the shipwrights had recently affiliated with the Waterside Workers' Union, put in a claim for higher wages and allowances, and from May until October, negotiations with their employers dragged on. On the 17th of October, the employers rejected the shipwrights' claim. On the 18th, the shipwrights went on strike, and on the 22nd, the Wellington Watersiders held a stop work meeting to discuss how they would support their comrades. And while they were meeting, the employers put other workers on. The Watersiders demanded reinstatement and refused to work until they were reinstated, whereupon the employers said that the stop work meeting amounted to a strike, that the Waterside workers had, by that action, terminated the industrial agreement, and it was now null and void. Well, pickets went up on the 23rd of October. The next day there was some violence between Watersiders and strike breakers who were already coming in. The employers offered reinstatement on the old conditions, but without a formal industrial agreement, as we would now say, on individual contracts. The Watersiders refused this, as they also refused to form a new union more to the employers' liking. On the 26th, the Commissioner of Police, John Cullen, decided to enrol special constables. Over the following few days, there were confrontations on the Wellington waterfront between strikers and picketers, and on the strike breakers and pickets, I should say. And on the 28th, the government made plans to reinforce the police with the army. Now, the Chief of Staff advised that that would be a very bad idea, but offered to use the networks of the territorials to recruit strike breakers and special constables anyway, soldiers by another name, effectively. So when that became known, the Auckland and Westport watersiders went out. On the 30th of October, mounted specials arrived in Wellington. Armed sailors from a Royal Navy ship paraded in Wellington, and machine guns were placed on Buckle Street. And the specials attacked massed unionists around Post Office Square and Lambton Quay. All watersiders in New Zealand were now called out on strike, and all major ports were out by the 31st of October. Also on that day, miners started to come out across the country. More and more specials came into Wellington, and employers, farmers and others set up defence committees to organise and supply the specials and the strike breakers. Attempts at settlement went back and forth without success. On the 3rd of November, Wellington seamen struck. On the 6th, 2,000 special constables moved into Auckland, occupied the waterfront the next day, and that provoked a general strike in Auckland City. Within a few days, 10,000 Auckland workers were on strike. Slowly, strike breakers were mustered in the main ports and tension remained high. By the 22nd of November, the strike had effectively been broken, but miners, seamen, drivers and some watersiders remained out, protesting, but critically, railway workers and shearers did not join the strike. Now the employers refused negotiation on anything but their own terms. By the middle of December, the strike was effectively over. On the 22nd of December, watersiders returned to work, marching behind the union brass bands. And a few days after Christmas, the miners went back to work as well. Well, why did all this happen? The strike of 1913 suggests a deeply polarised society, and it was the culmination of a wave of radicalisation that had swept through the labour movement, or at least parts of it, in the previous decade. Eric Olson, one of New Zealand's most eminent labour historians, has said that 1913 was the final decisive stage in a long and complicated process that had begun in the 1880s, the making of the New Zealand working class. Whether it was the final decisive stage can be debated, but to explain the strike we need to trace that process, and that's what I would like to take a little bit of time to do. If we go back a generation before 1913 to 1890, we find a period of rapid social and political reform. Almost all men had won the vote by 1879, and additional votes for the propertied were abolished in 1889, that is to say, one man, one vote. Women's suffrage was in the air and would be won in 1893. Small farmers and aspiring farmers talked of land reform and closer settlement. Radical literature was widely circulated and freely discussed. Coming out of the Long Depression, workers in many trades and occupations had formed unions on both sides of the Tasman during the later 1880s. And in the winter of 1890, seamen, miners and watersiders, federated into the Maritime Council, struck to enforce their demands for formal recognition by employers, and in a bitter struggle were defeated. Well, in New Zealand, the strikers' defeat was followed by the 1890 general election. Labour activists were prominent. A Christchurch shoemaker, William Tanner, who would be elected to Parliament in that year, declared that the strikers were defending the existence of unionism, which is the only safeguard of the artisan against the capitalist. Noting that the 1890 election was the first under one man, one vote, Tanner said that this new democracy looked ultimately to a rearrangement of society on the basis of a true commonwealth, eliminating the individualism of the present materialistic age. And the 1890s as a moment in New Zealand's history of radical, progressive, utopian thought, I think could stand a reassessment. They could stand a new study. What emerged from the election was a progressive and reformist Liberal government, broadly supported by small farmers, would-be farmers, many small business owners, and many urban workers, and led first by John Ballance at the top, and then by Richard Seddon below him. And between 1891 and 95, Parliament enacted a wave of reformist legislation, including land reform, labour reform, women's suffrage, and most importantly for our purposes, the 1894 Industrial Conciliation and Arbitration Act. Now, the Act explicitly declared that it was an act to encourage the formation of trade unions. It provided, as we see up there, that any 7 workers in the same trade and the same district could form a union, register it, and state a case for resolution either by conciliation or by a formal arbitration court hearing. Now, if the court, which consisted of a judge, an employer's representative, and a worker's representative, heard the case, it would issue a binding decision called an award. Many of you will remember the days of the arbitration court and its awards. It was a system that in various guises persisted really until 1987, when the Labour government's Labour Relations Act changed it somewhat, and then 3-4 years later the National Government's Employment Contracts Act sank it. As Olsen has noted, the Act was spectacularly successful in one of its stated aims, encouraging the formation of trade unions and bringing, by 1905, many thousands of workers into them. It was also for a time successful in removing strikes from the scene, because a condition that was usually put in awards was that no strikes would be permitted during the life of an award. Yet there had been an unresolved question at the heart of the 1890 Liberal victory. Was organised labour a junior partner in the Progressive Coalition or an equal one? John Ballance, referring more generally to this question, had rejected the increasingly common idea that working men should exclusively be represented by their own. What is wanted, he said, is a broad liberal programme which will protect the rights of labour and promote wholesome reforms of every description. So Ballance believed in cooperation between classes as a good middle-class liberal. William Tanner, who I mentioned a minute ago, explicitly rejected that and hoped that working men would not be satisfied with working men's friends, but would insist on the genuine article. But organised labour was probably not strong enough to insist on that for some time. And what changed the calculus further was that the 1893 election greatly reinforced the farmer wing of the Liberal Party. And although Seddon got the Arbitration Act through, he made it clear that there was little enthusiasm for further labour legislation. But the union movement had been greatly weakened by the maritime strike, and for some years most trade unionists were content to bed the arbitration system in and to recruit members. Fast forward now to about 1905, and Labour's allegiance to the Liberal coalition began to weaken. The non-Labour majority in the Liberal Party continued to resist further reform. More generally, the government, and especially Seddon, had become greatly attached to imperial rhetoric and empire loyalty during and after the South African War, right at the turn of the century. Whereas Ballance had espoused an almost anti-imperialist nationalism, Seddon by 1900 was quite a noisy imperialist. After Seddon's death in 1906, the Liberal government, now led by Joseph Ward, shifted further to the right. One point on which Labour activists of whatever camp agreed was on opposing the Liberals' increasing military emphasis, especially the gift of a hugely expensive dreadnought battleship to the Royal Navy in 1909, and the 1910 Defence Act, which imposed compulsory military training in peacetime. Many union activists had regarded the union movement as the conscience of the Liberal Party and resented the stalling of reform. And a younger generation of activists who had not been involved in 1890, had not been shaped by that defeat, started to become prominent. In 1905, a variety of union-sponsored Labour candidates stood in the parliamentary election, none of them doing particularly well, but advocating an independent Labour Party of and for the workers, which would vote according to principle, independent of other parties. Well, I've spent a little time on this long background because much of the historical memory about radical Labour politics in the years before 1913 emphasises the militant, unskilled workers, especially the miners, and especially the famous strike at Blackball in 1908. Partly this might be because uncompromising militancy is retrospectively appealing. Certainly the miners and their allies had some eloquent publicists who told a good story. None better than Pat Hickey, who Peter Clayworth is writing a biography of. Pat Hickey was a most eloquent speaker and writer, and his little book Red-Fed Memoirs is still well worth looking at. Broadly speaking, the key issue for these militants was a belief that the arbitration system constrained workers and denied them the progress which mass unions and direct action would achieve. They described arbitration as Labour's leg iron, arguing that the trade-off of no strikes during the life of an award was unacceptable, that the emphasis on a judicial process demobilised mass organisation and turned unions into tame bureaucratic committees. As the Radicals' best publicist, Pat Hickey, put it, under arbitration, unions existed not as fighting battalions in a workers' army, but merely as revenue-paying propositions that made possible office equipment, salaries, and the expenses entailed in securing awards. The new approach of relying on mass organisation and direct action for direct negotiation with employers without judicial intermediaries, emphasising larger unions rather than the smaller occupationally divided ones, was often called industrial unionism. And to a very large extent, it was a model of organisation brought into New Zealand by the same Pat Hickey, who had spent time in the coal mines, the metal mines of the Western United States, where he had been profoundly influenced by the Western Federation of Miners and its industrial unionism model. Now, industrial unionism appealed most strongly to workers whose members didn't have a formal skill, who usually were located in strategic sectors of the export economy. Miners, watersiders, shearers, meat workers, sometimes general labourers as well. There was a lot of appeal in the rhetoric of independence and in a certain rough and ready approach, a feeling that skilled workers with their arbitrationist politics had gotten too respectable by half. Industrial unionists were not all the same. Some saw industrial unionism essentially as a matter of strategy, simply as more effective than arbitration, but an anarchist minority aligned with the industrial workers of the world out of the United States believed that struggle at the point of production would bring a revolutionary transformation of the whole society. Last night I was lucky to be at a book launch by Jared Davidson, a study of an anarchist tailor in Wellington who espoused IWW ideas very effectively and very eloquently. The book is called Sowing Freedom. It's a very nice piece of work. This new wave of radical industrial unionists followed through their rejection of arbitration by withdrawing from the arbitration system and registering their unions under an older law, the 1878 Trade Union Act. The advantage was that the 1878 Act did not prevent them from striking in the way that arbitration did. Consequently, a number of strikes took place between 1907 and 1911, some of them highly successful in winning improved wages and conditions, and unions adopting this approach formed the first New Zealand Federation of Labour in 1909, commonly known as the Red Federation, or the Red Feds for short. Now, most industrial unionists espoused radical politics, whether socialist or anarchist, but many skilled workers were becoming radical as well, perceiving that the arbitration system and the Liberal government were no longer nearly so responsive as they had once been. Unions often complained that the court's awards didn't increase wages to keep up with the cost of living, and gave significant ground to employers on other matters. There was widespread outrage in 1908 when the court sided with farmers and refused to give the Canterbury farm labourers an award of any sort. The employers' associations were becoming much better organised in the court and outside it, explicitly to counter growing union power. Radical skilled unionists, though, generally supported arbitration, believing that for many occupations, many trades, direct action was not practical. These skilled radicals also tended to argue that given that New Zealand enjoyed political democracy, it was better to build a Labour Party and work for a parliamentary majority that could then enact radical legislation. The Red Feds tended to treat parliamentary politics with a certain contempt, either taking the IWW view that organising at the point of production would lead to the revolution, or that parliamentary politics without a radical and mass union movement behind it was a waste of time and a road to selling out. But it wasn't only the working class that was changing. Many farmers who had supported the Liberal Party for years became more conservative as they became more prosperous. In 1890 and 93, the Liberals had championed smaller farmers against the large estate owners. But after 1905, parliamentary conservatism was reshaped into the Reform Party under the leadership of William Ferguson Massey, who was himself a small farmer, had begun his life in New Zealand indeed as a labourer, and this polarisation was no longer so convincing. And within the Reform Party, increasingly smaller and larger farmers came to emphasise their common interests. A key issue that undermined farmer support for the Liberals was land tenure. Liberal land reform policies had emphasised state leasehold, but many farmers who had benefited from that now wanted the option to freehold their leasehold properties. And the Farmers' Union mobilised around that question and also around keeping farm workers out of the arbitration system. So by the end of 1911, New Zealand society was becoming noticeably polarised, and the old liberal consensus was falling apart. Nothing indicated this so clearly as the general election at the end of 1911, which resulted in a hung parliament. For some months, the shape of government was uncertain. Then, in May of 1912, an industrial dispute in the gold mining town of Waihi became the flashpoint for many of these simmering tensions. Waihi is a story in itself, but the short version is that the Waihi Miners' Union had withdrawn from the arbitration system in 1911. Early in 1912, a small number of engine drivers at the mine formed a separate union and registered it back under the Arbitration Act. The miners saw this as a boss's ploy, and it certainly contradicted the Red Fed emphasis on one mass union in a worksite. So the miners struck in May, demanding that the arbitration union be disbanded. For some weeks there was essentially a standoff, but in July the Liberals were defeated on the floor of Parliament, and William Massey, on the left there, formed a reform government. Massey was no friend of militant unions, and explicitly intended to curb their power. And so Waihi became a dress rehearsal, in a way, for 1913, as the Massey government allowed the hardline police commissioner John Cullen, there on the right, to bring in armed police. The employers had already told the strikers that they would only be allowed back if they registered under the Arbitration Act, and from September, strike breakers began working the mine. Across the country, many of the unions which remained within the arbitration system and their United Labour Party openly opposed the strikers and the Red Federation. And so the Waihi strike was a focus for the rebelliousness of militant labour, for the divisions within the labour movement, for employers' strength, and the Reform Party's determination to check the radicals' progress. A couple of photographs from the strike. The left is a chalkboard message calling a meeting of miners, mothers, wives and sweethearts, and on the right a procession of women supporting the strikers. Women were particularly prominent as vocal supporters of the strike at Waihi, so much so that there are some delightful and almost unprintable documents by the police recounting the language which some of these militant women used. On 12th of November, Waihi reached its crisis. Strike breakers and the police attacked the Union Hall, explicitly intending to run the strikers out of town. In the fighting, some shots were fired, and a striker, Fred Evans, was beaten to death. And in the next couple of days, the strikers were indeed driven out of town. Suddenly, the contours of the labour movement changed. Many activists in the skilled arbitration unions were appalled at what had happened. Evans was the first person to be killed in an industrial dispute in New Zealand. And I think basically a wave of shock swept across much of the New Zealand labour movement, not only the Red Feds. But the Red Federation, for its part, drew the lesson that unity had to be achieved. A fortnight after Black Tuesday, the day on which Evans was killed, the Federation executive issued a broad invitation to all unions of whatever allegiance to a unity conference. This met in January 1913 and was a runaway success. 80 organisations across New Zealand were represented. And while many of the arbitrationist leaders were at first sceptical, it seems that the rank and file took over. As one old printers union activist, John Pettit, put it, the push for unity was a movement of the rank and file. As workers, as men, we have too long been separated. Our aims are identical, our hopes and dangers the same. We have wasted valuable years fighting amongst ourselves. The rank and file want to see these differences swept away, want to feel that the working class is a forward movement. And the conference produced a draft plan of unity, merging the arbitration-aligned United Labour Party and the more militant Socialist Party into a new Social Democratic Party, and turning the Red Federation into a new United Federation of Labour. And the proposals were widely discussed in labour and socialist organisations across the country over the next 6 months. In July 1913, a reconvened and much larger Unity Congress met, with nearly 400 delegates representing 247 organisations and 60,000 workers. And they confirmed the plan. The United Federation of Labour's objective was to organise systematically upon an industrial union basis in order to assist the overthrow of the capitalist system and bring about a cooperative commonwealth based upon industrial democracy. The Social Democratic Party advocated the socialisation of the collectively used means of production, distribution and exchange. Another old printer and liberal parliamentarian, a member of the upper house, John Rigg, chaired the conference and observed that the time has come when the workers should govern themselves. They have too long sat at the foot of other parties and have had to beg as favours what they should have demanded and taken as right. Now, both Pettit and Rigg were printers, and that is significant because the printers were, in a way, archetypal, skilled arbitrationist workers. Very strong traditions of craft pride, very strong commitment to rational and democratic politics, but also a strong shop floor culture. So that Pettit and Rigg were talking in these terms suggests the depth of the radicalisation of some skilled workers at least. Labour politics had become markedly radical, and with the size of the Unity Congress, not only radical politics, but radical mass politics. Eric Olson has observed quite correctly that the Social Democratic Party platform was vastly more radical than any other Labour Party within the empire. And so this rather long narrative is the process which culminated in 1913. Because, not to put too fine a point on it, I think the Unity Congress scared the tar out of the Reform government, the farmers and the employers, and they determined to take steps to hobble or even strangle the new organisations at birth. That might be something of a conspiracy theory, but even in February of 1913, the New Zealand Employers' Federation established a defence fund to combat socialism, syndicalism and anarchy. At least one provincial employers' association had a secret meeting in August to plan the recruitment of strike breakers. No strike was taking place, they were just drawing up the plans. One of the first things Massey did as Prime Minister, and he was Minister of Labour as well, was to introduce legislation which effectively outlawed the tactic of cancelling registration under the Arbitration Act in order to pursue direct action. So unions were to be forced into the arbitration system, like it or not, and that bill went so far as to define a strike as including refusing to sign a new contract. So we come back now to the morning of the 22nd of October, when the Wellington Watersiders held their stop work meeting to discuss support for the shipwrights and found that others had been hired in their place when they returned to work. We learn from a minute book which the Turnbull Library very recently acquired that that very afternoon over a dozen representatives of ship owners met and rapidly agreed to terminate the Watersiders Industrial Agreement and to form a committee dealing with all matters arising. That became the Wellington Strike Committee, later rebranded as the Citizens Defence Committee. It seems likely, I think, that employers had this sort of plan in mind some time before October and were waiting for an excuse. On the 23rd of October, the ship owners indicated that they would insist either on what we would now call individual employment agreements, or at most that the Waterfront Union had to be registered under the Arbitration Act. The Employers' Federation urged the Strike Committee not to even meet any union that was not registered under the Arbitration Act and not to waver. Hundreds of special constables were rapidly recruited, many from rural districts, of course, many being farmers, some from the towns as well. Neither side, of course, was a monolith. The United Federation of Labour leadership would have settled late in October on the basis of staying outside arbitration but giving a bond of a substantial sum of money against breaking the agreement. But the Watersiders themselves refused to agree to that. Some farmers were making conciliatory noises, like the Wairarapa sheep farmer and Reform politician William Buchanan, but these were completely disavowed by Taranaki dairy farmers who were noticeably hardline. While the UFL leadership kept advocating the bond idea, the ship owners handed the dispute over to the Employers' Federation, which insisted on compulsory arbitration. On 4th of November, the Employers' Federation Chief William Pryor issued that ultimatum to the United Federation leadership, and that ended any chance of a negotiated settlement. At that point, rage swept the Wellington streets. 2,000 strikers and supporters gathered in Buckle Street. The specials charged and were met with stones and gunfire. When the specials had gone, the crowd came back, but remarkably an army officer, Major Hume, basically persuaded everyone to go home before somebody got killed, and that happened. It's important too not to regard the police and the army as unified. They were not. Many ordinary police officers were highly uncomfortable about events and about being used as a political police force. That indeed was one of the government's big worries. And some senior army officers, including the Chief of Staff, thought that the specials had been unduly provocative, hiding behind machine guns on the 30th of October. But the same Chief of Staff regarded opening the wharves as urgent, and he advised the Strike Committee on the 5th of November, the Defence Committee, that if the wharves weren't reopened, the specials would get bored and go home. So that day, 5th of November, 800 mounted specials forced the wharves open, were stoned by the crowds and charged several times. And there were also a number of large and peaceful marches in support. Now in Auckland, when the miners and the watersiders went out, Massey asked the Farmers' Union to organise strike breakers. The New Zealand Herald, unusually sardonically perhaps, put it, this was a righteous crusade to preserve social order and the butter stocks. Again, we can see Massey spoiling for a fight, for he sacked the conciliatory Auckland Police Superintendent, who was too even-handed for the liking of the farmers and the Auckland Employers Federation. But while Auckland had the biggest strike, something like 10,000 workers out in the Auckland General Strike, there was less violence than in Wellington. Strikers threw stones and firecrackers at the specials, but the specials were more restrained, more disciplined than they were in Wellington. It's one of the support marches that I mentioned, behind one of those glorious union banners, the Waterside Workers' Union, down to Newtown Park in Wellington. And another, I think that might be Post Office Square, same banner in evidence. Yeah. So there were very considerable shows of support, and that momentum was kept up for some weeks. Well, the Auckland General Strike on the 8th of November led the United Federation to call a one-day national general strike, but that didn't work. In fact, the United Federation of Labour's strength was among the same unions as had dominated the Red Federation. Most of the skilled unions, whatever their views, hadn't joined by the time the strike began. The working class was not united. The railway workers refused to come out despite urgent pleas. They hadn't joined the UFL. They'd walked out of the July Unity Conference, complaining that the strategy was strike first, strike second, strike all the time. The thing with the railway workers was that the Liberal government in the 1890s had very cleverly made a sweetheart deal with them. The railway workers retained favourable working conditions, the union was recognised, they got superannuation, and those conditions prevailed so long as they didn't affiliate to any labour federation. And in 1913 that paid off. The shearers stayed at work too, not least because they feared their weakness. With so many farmers' sons and ununionised Māori shearing anyway, they feared that they were not in a strong position and would disappear as a union if they did strike. So with most ports working again by mid or late November, the strikers' position was weakening. Two things signalled the Watersiders' defeat. One was a Supreme Court judgment on the 12th of December that held that the Arbitration Act forbade unions to contribute to the strike funds of other unions, so solidarity was outlawed. The other was when the seamen went back on the 17th of December, again to preserve their own organisation. This cartoon from a non-Labour newspaper entitled "Cutting the Painter" shows the seamen cutting the tie to the red-fed berthing post, the ship about to sail off, the Watersiders looking horrified in response. But with the seamen going back, the Watersiders really had no choice but to concede themselves. One reason why the seamen went back was that they were encouraged to do so by the fact that the Union Steamship Company made it clear that they would continue outside the arbitration system if they wished. The Union Company's chieftain, James Mills, saw no point in years of conflict and was quite happy to allow the Union to continue rather than insisting on a new company union. So the Watersiders had no choice but to go back behind their brass bands, which they did, and the miners went back shortly after Christmas. Both miners and Watersiders were forced into arbitration unions. The Seamen's Union, just to clarify, always had been fairly strongly arbitrationist, but also had feelings of solidarity to a greater or lesser extent. Well, what was the aftermath of all this? Within a year, the far greater crisis of the war would dominate people's minds, and I think also dominates historical memory, which is one reason why the 1913 strike was almost forgotten for a long time. Soon enough, the miners and Watersiders had taken over the new arbitration unions and made them militant again, with the exception of Auckland, where the waterfront employers blacklisted militants for a couple of years. In some ways, the war improved Labour's bargaining position, in other ways it did not. Some of the strike leaders were prosecuted and received shorter or longer terms of imprisonment. The heaviest sentence went to Harry Holland, the journalist and socialist agitator, who got 12 months for seditious language in Wellington and urging the police and troops to come over to the strikers' side. Apparently, so it was alleged, he said that the troops should remember where their class interests lay and point their guns accordingly. Holland would go on to lead the Labour Party in Parliament from 1919 until his death on Taupiri Mountain at King Te Rata's funeral in 1933. Massey would be Prime Minister until 1925. That cartoon shows his trophies from left to right. The Waihi Strike 1912, the Smallpox Scare 1913, the Big Strike 1913, and the German War in 1914. It's an optimistic cartoon because it's published in November of 1914. But Massey would be the dominant political figure for the next 15 years, dying in office in 1925. Historians continue to debate his administration. He never had another confrontation with organised labour on the scale of 1912-13. He had got what he wanted in forcing the militants into arbitration. But during the war, his approach to dissent was similarly ruthless as it had been in 1913. How much did the Great Strike change the labour movement? Eric Olson has argued that it shifted things very much to the left, that all had changed utterly. Nobody who opposed the 1913 strike, he says, remained a Labour leader. And even so-called moderates like the Seamen's Tom Young, the furniture craftsman Dan Sullivan, and the shop assistant James McCombs supported the strike once the battle was joined. Politically, says Olson, the middle ground passed to the advocates of a socialist Labour Party, and the use of Massey's Cossacks, he says, did more than anything else to unify the working class. An early sign of this occurred in the dying days of the strike. There was a by-election in the port seat of Lyttelton, which since 1899 had been represented by the radical liberal George Lawrenson. Now, Lawrenson had supported the strikers, and when he died, the by-election was won in a convincing victory by the Social Democratic Party's James McCombs. This Māori Land Worker cartoon shows the Social Democratic motor having run Massey over, and he's portrayed in the usual unflattering light that paper indulged in. Lyttelton remained a McCombs family fiefdom until 1951. First James, then his wife Elizabeth, then their son Terence, who lost the seat in 1951 in the wake of another great waterfront dispute. But political unity was far from complete. In the 1914 general election, there were Labour candidates who refused to join the Social Democrats. Labour's political unity was achieved only in 1916, and it was tenuous, for then Bolshevism and communism led to further divisions in the 1920s. Labour's electoral success would depend on the Liberal and Reform parties merging, which took many years to complete, not in fact until the Depression coalition of 1931. Peter Franks has emphasised that most unions didn't take up the United Federation's radicalism, and indeed a chastened UFL became somewhat more moderate in 1914. And for all their dissatisfaction with the practice, most unions continue to support the principle of arbitration. Olsen also emphasises that the ground shifted from industrial to political action. In a memorable phrase, he has said that the conditions for a successful general strike were the conditions for a successful revolution, and that did not happen in 1913. So there are ambiguities. Ambiguity is inherent in history and in historical analysis. But I'd like to finish referring to the words of Jeff Ely, a great historian of the European left. There remains something uniquely inspiring in the spectacle of masses of people in political motion collectively engaging the future. I'd like to give the last word to the Watersiders of Lyttelton, partly because it was in that context that I first encountered the Great Strike 30 years ago. Although Lyttelton was not a storm centre as Wellington and Auckland were, the Lyttelton Watersiders struck for weeks, and the day before the Specials took over Lyttelton, the Union issued a manifesto, which related the strike to years of dissatisfaction with the arbitration court and the Liberals. The Union asked, "If arbitration fails workers on matters upon which politicians are diffident to legislate, is it any wonder that confidence in the scheme is supplanted by criticism? And when arbitration fails, what other means can be adopted to protect the workers' interests but the strike, particularly when a government is in power whose only effort at labour legislation has been coercion and repression?" And the manifesto ended with an appeal to the workers to be loyal to their class and to show their reprobation of a government whose law and order is a semi-military display of batons and firearms, and whose whole attitude towards a constitutional and peacefully conducted strike has been destitute of any sense of moral purpose and empty of any understanding of the facts of workers' lives. A response to this appeal will ensure victory and, what is essential to greatness in any country, an independent and self-reliant working class. Kia ora tātou.
Open for questions.
Indeed, yes.
Open for questions.